Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Science or Fiction podcast, the podcast that interviews researchers to separate the science from the fiction in news headlines. I'm your host, Dr. Catherine Bates. I'm a youth development researcher at King's College London, and this is the Science or Fiction podcast. First, a content warning. In this episode, we discuss loneliness and mental health issues, including depression and anxiety. If you are affected by any of the issues discussed, we've included resources on our website, www.scienceorfiction.co.uk. Also, just to note that we're not talking about individual cases of mental health and other issues. Instead, we're talking about the research in general and what the evidence shows. So in today's episode, we are talking about loneliness. Why are young people lonely and what can we do about it? We all experience loneliness to some degree, but there's still stigma around it. Our awareness of loneliness and the conversation around it has spiked since the COVID-19 pandemic, when many people were isolated due to restrictions on movement and socializing. Media coverage has recently claimed that we're experiencing an epidemic of loneliness, and in November 2023, the World Health Organization declared loneliness a global threat. But even prior to the pandemic, research has shown that young people experience higher rates of loneliness compared to all other age groups. Research findings like this are frequently reported in the news and in the media, and this is often in short articles with catchy headlines. And in this format, details of the research are lost. So we need to understand more about research findings so that we can make our own conclusions and decide for ourselves what action to take. Today, we're talking to researcher Dr. Lily Verity and activist Molly Taylor about why young people experience such high levels of loneliness and what we can do about it. Welcome, Lily and Molly. It's really great to have you here. So I'm just going to let you introduce yourselves, and it'd be great to hear about what you do and potentially an unexpected detour that led you to your current job. So I always ask people like what they do, but I think it's really useful for listeners to hear like the different ways that you might end up in research or policy. So Molly, shall we start with you?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, and I'm feeling very grateful to have this conversation. So yeah, a bit about me is I've been an activist in loneliness for the past 2 years. I've actually been volunteering for 10, so I've always had the activist hat on and felt like I have a social responsibility in the world to make it a better place. But I think the reason I've now really honed in on loneliness is because I felt it myself. And again, like you've mentioned, a lot of young people do. So I can definitely bring in that lived experience. And I know that when I have that lived experience, I feel most passionate about it. So yeah, in the last 2 years, I've been an activist. And by that, I mean, I started my journey with youth work. I'm a youth worker who really helped me open up and feel listened to and heard, and at a time when I felt really lonely and I didn't know that I could do anything about it. And then they gave me some tools for me to take proactive action, not only for myself and my own loneliness, but also for others. So I've done a lot over the past 2 years, and I'm sure I can talk about that a little bit more as we go on with the conversation. But I suppose in the response to an unexpected detour is that 2 years ago, I felt really lonely at university. I felt very stuck. I was expecting that I would finish with a degree and then go on to perhaps do policy in the future. But actually, this year, due to feelings of loneliness and actually just wanting to take more of a grip on my life and more control, I decided to stop my degree and go straight into policy. And it's through the experience of being an activist and those core essential skills or life skills that I've gained through activism, such as teamwork, influencing, leadership and policy analysis, I've now been able to secure myself a full-time role in policy. So it'll be nice to reflect on that and show how you can also get a job through activism and volunteering. So thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about like all the activism stuff you're doing. So Lily, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so I'm Lily, and I'm a researcher focusing on loneliness in young people. So I finished my PhD last year, and I guess it was like kind of unexpected for me to get into the research side of things and loneliness and everything like that. I wasn't really expecting to go down that route. Like originally in my undergraduate degree, I did forensic psychology, so it's quite different to what I've ended up doing. But yeah, like I was working at a golf club behind the bar, just kind of like not really sure what to do next after I finished uni. And I decided to do an internship, so like a paid internship at the university that I went to, so UCLan in Preston. And I ended up meeting Pam Qualter, who's an expert in loneliness. And through that, I kind of like grew my passion for the area, and I went from not even knowing what a PhD was to signing up to do a PhD. So yeah, prior to doing the internship, I didn't have any idea what research like jobs were, what a PhD was, and now I've ended up with one, and I'm doing a research job. So I guess that was my unexpected detour. Just so happens that I ended up on that internship, and yeah, here I am.
That's awesome. Thank you. Let's get into it then. So I would like to start by defining loneliness. So what is loneliness? And we actually had a few questions sent in this month from listeners, which I've like peppered throughout the episode. So one person asked, is loneliness about a physical connection or an emotional connection?
That is a really interesting question. I think for me personally, my personal opinion is that there's two sides to this. So, for example, a lot of people might have an assumption that loneliness is literally being alone in your room and not being surrounded by people. However, there has been research and evidence finds, and just people's experience, lived experience, shows that they can feel incredibly lonely whilst in a room full of people. It can happen to anyone in any environment. So, in that response, it's not necessarily about the physical connection, because you can be in any place in space and still feel lonely. I think for me personally, looking back on my own lived experience and how I've spoken to other young people about their experiences as well, it's often that you don't feel heard. You don't feel like, it might be a conversation like, oh, how are you doing? And it's not really a deep level conversation. It's not really a meaningful conversation. So then you don't feel as heard and listened to, and your needs aren't met on an emotional scale. And that's what I felt personally. Of course I knew a lot of people at university when I felt most lonely, but it was that kind of small talk that I really disliked and actually didn't sit well with me. For some people it might, but for me personally, with other barriers in the way, it just made me more susceptible to feeling incredibly lonely. So that's how I would answer the question, but I'm curious to know what Lily would say.
You know what? I would say pretty much the same thing. So, yeah, it's more about like an emotional disconnection than a physical one. And in all of the research that I've done, whenever we've talked about, like, is there a difference between being alone and loneliness? People always say, yeah, you can be happy with being alone. It can be quite a refreshing thing, but loneliness, it's like an emotional experience, a negative emotional experience. And I would say that it kind of focuses on, I guess this touches on what you said, Molly, about, the mismatch between kind of the desired qualities of your relationships and the relationships that you actually have. So like wanting those better quality conversations, more meaningful relationships with people can be a way that loneliness kind of crops up.
I think that's really interesting what you say about like small talk. And I think about the amount of times when probably like 10 times a day someone says, hey, how are you? And I say, I'm fine, thanks. How are you? And I'm not always fine, but that's kind of, that's like our polite, small talk conversation. It doesn't give you that opportunity to get into like how you're actually feeling. And I can see how even with seeing people regularly, that can, lead you to feeling really lonely, sorry. The word physical there has also made me think about, and I wonder if there's much on this or if you've reflected on this before, but it's made me think about how it actually physically makes me feel. I think when I was also at university or when I was younger, I've also experienced what I would call, like, I don't know, severe loneliness at different times. And it almost feels like a physical ache that I can't really compare to like other, other emotions that I have. And I wonder if there's like, do people talk about having like that physical feeling that might be different from, say, they're feeling anxious or something else?
I know that for me, I often describe it as like, for example, my room but no longer became a safe haven, and it was like the walls were caving in on me. So it's almost like an anxiety-esque feeling. But when I went to the doctor or tried to find support, it wasn't pinpointed as that. So it's clear that there was a difference between the two. So that was a really interesting point, Catherine, of how you've described that. And yeah, getting us to speak about the physical connection is really important as well.
Yeah, when I've like talked to young people about kind of the way that loneliness feels in your body and things like that, it is kind of like it's like a wave over your body. Some people say like a weight on your chest. So there is definitely some sort of like physical element to it that people can put, imagery to. Like being in a dark room and darkness and things like that is very common. Talked about as well. So definitely.
We've kind of talked about young people a little bit already. So what do we know about loneliness in young people? So I've seen that there is some research that has reported, and I mentioned in the introduction, higher rates of loneliness in young people compared to other age groups, which might surprise some people. And like, why is this? Do we know?
When we think about loneliness, it peaks in kind of adolescence and older adulthood. So it's not that it doesn't happen like in older adulthood, it absolutely does, but it's just that it's kind of like we've not focused so much on it in younger people. And I think that kind of the reasons for it cropping up at that time is there's a lot of transitional things happening. There's a lot of even hormonal kind of identity formation and figuring out where you fit in with the people that are around you, kind of going from maybe you've left primary school, going to high school, going to college, and going through different educational steps and meeting new people can really make you assess how you fit in, how your values and your beliefs align with other people, and if you're kind of not getting to grips with who you'd consider to be like the people that you identify with, the like-minded people, then that can be a really lonely experience.
That is really interesting. I kind of want to, I suppose, flesh them out a bit more. I would say it's definitely along the right lines, the same as you, because I felt it myself, and it was during those transition periods that I felt it most. But I just really want to touch on the stigma and how I remember growing up, I would see Age UK campaigns on the telly about loneliness in elderly. And I'm not saying that still doesn't happen. Loneliness can happen at any age to anyone, which is a really important message to remember. But we never heard about young people. And still to this day, a lot of people prick their ears up thinking, oh, young people are lonely, despite there being a lot more research and evidence now about youth loneliness. So I think if we get to the point of destigmatizing it, for example, like we have done with a lot of mental health diagnoses in at current, and have done over the past 10 or so years, then I'm sure this will be one way to make sure that everyone's aware of it, and it could really help people not get to the point of loneliness, and it would be a preventative measure if we're talking about it more often and not stigmatizing it and making young people feel embarrassed because they're labelled as young and lonely, when ultimately we grow up in a society where we're told that this is going to be the best part of our lives. University is going to be where we make the longest friendships, but in reality, when it doesn't happen, it can be quite hard hitting and embarrassing for young people, and I know that was for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Like just picking up on that as well, you know, those social expectations. We've had young people talk about that as well, you know, expected to be in a friendship group at that age. You're surrounded by people at school and at college, university, like you're expected to be part of a friendship group. And some people don't necessarily need that, but it can make them feel like maybe there's something not right with them because they've not got that. And which absolutely isn't the case. You know, everyone's got different needs in terms of friendship and relationships. So yeah, definitely the expectations is something that comes into things.
I think there might be something else also worth adding, is the barriers that young people face. It makes them more susceptible to feeling lonely. Obviously, we know there's a huge mental health crisis going on at the moment, and more than ever, young people feel incredibly lonely, but are also going through other mental health crises at the same time. And so, whilst loneliness is separate to a mental health condition or diagnosis, it can lead to mental health problems in the future, or other way around, mental health crisis that they face may also then lead to loneliness because of just the way that they're not able to resonate with other young people around them. And I think in this day and age, there's a lot of barriers that young people are facing. They're often linked with each other. So a child might be going through multiple barriers at once, which then leads to loneliness.
Yeah, definitely. And it sounds like the potentially like social expectations and barriers like issue can be linked. So if you're, you know, going off to university or whatever, and you assume and everyone assumes around you that you're going to make like the best friends for the rest of your life and all that kind of stuff. But if you don't have the right support in place at university, or if there are barriers to you accessing like, I don't know, maybe the friendships that you need or like the conversations you need to have, then what you expect to happen is not going to match up. So in each episode, we dive into the research behind news headlines. And this week, the headlines are Generation Z are now the loneliest generation, Metro UK, December 2022. The loneliness epidemic threatens our health as well as our happiness, Financial Times, May 2023. So there's two important points to explore there. And that's why young people are so lonely and how loneliness might impact our health or our mental health, like Molly, you've already touched on. So the paper that we were going to cover this week is one published by Lily, and it has recently published a journal article exploring loneliness in young people, titled Fit to Belong, Loneliness from the Perspectives of Adolescents from 5 European Countries. And that was published in the Journal of Frontiers of Education. So can you just summarize like the main findings and the methods in the study for us?
Fit to Belong was part of a wider Erasmus Plus project. So we were collaborating with teachers and youth centres across Europe, so 5 different European countries, which were Lithuania, Poland, Portugal, Serbia and Turkey. The aim of the overall project is to kind of think about building materials and things to promote belongingness in schools. With those teachers and youth centres and young people from the schools. So the study that, like we've talked about, is part of that, and it involved semi-structured interviews with young people from those schools or youth centres. And they were done online because it was during the pandemic, and it was with the counsellors or psychologists that worked at the schools or youth centres. So we were really lucky that that could kind of go ahead, because the initial idea was that I would go and visit them and be able to do those interviews myself, but that didn't end up happening, obviously. So there is also kind of the aspect of that people had experienced social isolation at that point, which is, you know, not the same as loneliness, but it has the potential to lead to loneliness. So there was more talk about loneliness and things like that. So it could potentially be that like the young people in the study had a bit more of an idea than they might have done previously, which was a good thing, I think, in this instance. So basically, we asked them questions about what they thought loneliness was and what they would suggest to do to cope with it. And we wanted to know if there were differences in the way young people across the different countries and within those different countries there were different cultures, and if loneliness was understood in the same way, or if there were differences in what loneliness was between the countries. And so what we found were that there were actually kind of no meaningful qualitative differences, which is good to know that basically across those countries, loneliness was talked about in the same way. And that is reflected in qualitative research that's been done with adults as well. So it seems like there is kind of, I don't want to say a universal idea of what loneliness is, because we've only looked at European countries, so there's still the potential to understand it further. But it does seem like it is something that is understood in the same way across cultures and across countries.
Brilliant, thank you. And I guess we can quickly define what qualitative research is and maybe what a semi-structured interview might look like.
Yeah, absolutely. So qualitative research is the easiest way to describe it is that it's research through words. So, talking to people, asking them about things. It's not the statistical side of things where you'd look at all the numbers, and it's really looking at the meaning of things. That was the important thing that we wanted to do, was focus on the understanding that young people had of things. And a semi-structured interview would kind of be, so I created an interview schedule, so some questions that I was going to ask, and then from that we asked those questions, but if there was anything that came up through asking those questions, we asked additional questions as well, was the idea. So there is a structure to it, but it's not that you have to stick just to the structure of the interview. You can ask as you would in a conversation when things crop up.
And I'm interested to know, I guess, what you both think about why. So we've actually only discussed quantitative research so far in this podcast. It tends to be studies that have loads of participants and data and statistical analysis. But why do you think it's important that we use these qualitative methods to really understand the experience of loneliness in our, broad quest to understand what loneliness is and why it occurs and what we can do about it?
So I think it's important to use qualitative methods because it's kind of giving meaning to the relationships that you'd find in quantitative research. So you might find that loneliness is associated with depression, but what's actually going on there? Why does that relationship exist? The only way that you can really find out about those things is by asking people about it. And also, like I said, research is focused more on older adults, so a lot of the measurements and things that have been created for loneliness in young people have been based on that sort of research, whereas it seems like it makes sense to go back and ask young people what they think loneliness is first and foremost, because it's their experiences. They're going to be the experts on their own experiences.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Lily. And I, as a young person myself, and obviously have been contributing to research on loneliness for the past 2 years, lived experience is so important, and it's something that is so unique, and every young person should be treated as an individual. And I think truly that's how we're going to be able to tackle it and make sure that there is a holistic approach to treating and preventing loneliness in the future. Also, I would like just to address that by being a participant with something like this, it can reap a lot of benefits for the young people as long as the research is done really well, and obviously ethics, etc. But it makes them feel like they feel heard and valued, which, like I mentioned earlier, when loneliness popped up for me, that's something that I felt I lacked. So actually, by having these conversations like we are now, feeling like I'm a participant here today and doing other research, I felt very valued and heard. And it's one way that I've actually overcome loneliness, because it's making me aware that there's a lot of work being done. But when you're in your room and you feel lonely and you're in that crippling mindset and feeling overwhelmed of anxiety, you don't realize that there are people trying to help you out there. So I think in that way, it's so important to always reach out and speak to people that you're trying to find answers for, because it gives more value to them than you may think.
That's actually really, really nice to hear, because often, like, we know that, like, young people who come along to, like, the arts workshops and things like that, like, we can see that they've really enjoyed themselves, but you don't often get to hear, exactly how it's impacted being a participant. So yeah, that's really nice to hear, actually.
Yeah, whereas numbers can't really encapsulate the emotions and the benefit of that research. So I think it's really important.
Yeah, that's a really important point about involving young people themselves, as well as like just having researchers conduct studies as well, right? You've kind of answered my question that was going to be about like the fact that this wider project that your study is a part of, I read that it's like a collaboration between researchers and young people and teachers. And I wanted to know like why that might be important. But I also really like this idea that you suggested, that like being a part of something to do with loneliness, whether that's a research project or maybe even like a campaign on social media or something like that, could actually combat your own loneliness. And that's like quite a nice like full circle of like supporting each other, even through just having those conversations.
Yeah, so I think I've kind of mentioned it before, but that's why youth work for me worked really well, in the fact that I was 21 when I first accessed youth work, and it was through a program on loneliness. So I was able to be a leader in that program. There was myself and 12 other young people that had lived experience of loneliness, and then we were able to shape campaigns of the wider movement of the wider organisation, which is UK Youth, and they're one of the largest youth organisations in the UK. We're able to go to Parliament, speak to stakeholders, speak to researchers about our experiences, and I've been part of that group now for 2 years, and it's honestly been the tool that I needed to overcome loneliness. I've been to the GP, I've spoken to mental health helplines, I've tried social prescribing, which we know is something that is being trialled at the moment, but none of those things seem to work the same as just connecting with other young people and feeling listened by a wider movement that are tackling loneliness.
Centering young people's voices on these issues is really important. From the perspective of adults, like, we can reflect on our experiences from when we were younger, but it's not the same as finding that out from those who are experiencing things directly now, and the social context of their lives that influence their experiences. It's really important to get all of that and keep their voices at the centre of research as well. So I try to be very mindful of staying close to participants' words during analysis and things like that. So making sure to use like phrases that have been used by the participants is something that's really important. Using quotes also really important, so that it's not lost in kind of the academic words that are being put to things.
This is just such an interesting point, because in our mental health research, for example, we're working with young people to make sure that we hear their perspectives and have like lived experience in our projects. And you see a lot of that's like more common now, having young people integrated into research that's about them. But it just didn't occur to me that having young people with lived experience involved in loneliness research could then snowball to actually almost combating or protecting against loneliness because of this connection that you can build and knowledge and all that kind of stuff. I think that's a really nice thing to realize.
Yeah, definitely. It's something that you can definitely see as well when you know, like they're in the research and seeing how people are interacting with each other. You can see that people kind of connecting and making friends, but it's obviously not always something that you hear feedback on. So yeah, that's brilliant.
So a couple of the main themes that came up in the paper, and probably just to clarify that in the qualitative research, when you analyze the data, analyze the words, as Lily talked about, and analyze what people say, you pull out themes from the data. And a couple of those were that young people felt that they had felt difficulties in opening up to others, and also had a fear of vulnerability if they talked about loneliness. Do we think that this might be due to stigma around loneliness? And why do you think there is so much stigma around loneliness?
I think that it is due to the stigma around loneliness. Definitely, I think that the stigma can kind of be explained in the way that part of loneliness is, you know, perceiving yourself as different to the people that are around you, and, you know, not having those people around you who are kind of like-minded and have the same values and things like that. So also by admitting that you're lonely and not feeling that other people have that same issue, it's kind of also signifying that you're different in a way. So I think that's probably kind of where the stigma comes from, and, you know, not wanting to be seen as outside of the group. The evolutionary perspective of loneliness is that it exists to kind of signal to us that we need to be part of a group for protection. So if you're seen as being outside of the group, then you're seen as being vulnerable and in danger. So that's part of the reason why loneliness exists, is to signal that you need to reconnect and get back involved with the group. So I think by admitting to it is also one way that you can do that, but it also means that you're signalling that you acknowledge that you're not part of the group.
Yeah, I agree with all of your points, and I think I kind of touched on it earlier. So I've kind of raised the point of stigmatization of being one of the factors in causing or contributing to feelings of loneliness. One other point to make is, again, it just feels, as a young person, it feels quite embarrassing. There's a lot of socialization, as you know, in society, of how you're meant to be a certain way, and of course, back to that reflection on university in particular, and those transition periods meant to be, you know, a universal kind of a positive experience for everyone. But I think if we, you know, group that together, then it really misses out on people that don't feel those way or that emotion. And when you don't feel that positive experience, then it can be quite deflating, and you feel like an embarrassment, and feel like you've let people down, on maybe perhaps yourself, and then you start questioning your work, etc. But actually, it's just the way that we've kind of been brought up and socialized into thinking.
Yeah, it sounds like it can be a disconnect on so many levels, like a disconnect between what's expected of us, how we expect to feel, and what we expect like our social connections to be. Like, so it's like those things not adding up, but on multiple levels of like emotion and friends and social networks and so on.
Yeah, and I think there's also kind of like a stereotype about who it is that feels lonely, like that it's meant to be people who are awkward and outside of social circles and things like that, when it's just not the case. Anyone can feel lonely. You can feel lonely even if you've got good friends. It's just a case of, you know, the needs that you perceive aren't being met, or the difficulties that you're having with those friendships can be really impactful. So it's very much that maybe sometimes people don't want to identify themselves as lonely because they see it as kind of a stereotype that they don't identify with.
So I want to come to some more listener questions now. And this relates to what's been covered in the media as well about health implications on loneliness. So one of the questions was, what is the main biological impact of loneliness?
There is research that shows that loneliness has impact on sleep. So it can lead to sleeping too little or too much. Appetite as well, kind of the same thing, overeating or eating too little. I guess it depends on how your appetite is impacted by your emotions. There's also impacts on, like we've already talked about, other mental health issues. So it can be, I think we've already said that like loneliness can lead to like depression, and likewise depression can lead to loneliness. So there's like the impacts on physical health in that it leads to higher rates of morbidity, which is a really horrible thing to say, and I also think that it should be taken kind of with a pinch of salt. The impacts of loneliness on health overall, like whilst it is really important that we do consider the impacts of loneliness on health, it's not something that I would like to stress too much, because if you're lonely and you're worrying also about the impact of it on your health, I just think that that's an added stressor that doesn't necessarily need to be added onto things, because it's more likely to be like a chronic, if it's a chronic issue over a really long period of time. If you're kind of experiencing loneliness in like a transient way for short periods of time, then the impact on your health, I don't think we need to be too cautious about it. But I don't know what you think, Molly.
I would actually disagree with that, and I hope you don't mind me saying that. But as Catherine has said, recently the World Health Organization has said that loneliness is an epidemic. It's clear that there is evidence to suggest that it not only has impact on our mental and emotional health, but also physical health. There's been research to suggest that it's more those people that go through periods of chronic loneliness, so you're saying more long-term loneliness, and severe loneliness have more chance of cardiovascular disease in the future when they're older. Again, mortality rates more severe. And I think as well is that us humans, we thrive on human connection and that emotional well-being. And so actually, yes, there might not be a direct link perhaps to a physical long-term condition like you're mentioning. It will have ramifications in the future. And of course, it can also lead to, severe mental health crisis. And it does really impact young people's and anyone's lives, like their livelihoods. Like, there were times where I was eating 3 times a day by myself, and then it got to the point, or perhaps changing my appetite, which again, that might have like a threefold effect later down the line on things like diabetes or other diseases. And whilst, yes, there might not be a correlation right now, I think that the fact that the World Health Organization and other organizations across the world are thinking that this is quite a big epidemic that is literally waiting to happen is concerning. And I know that there are 2 million young people estimated to feel chronically lonely in the UK itself. And so I know that if there was a prevention method rather than a reactive preventative methods or treatment, I would so much prefer for us to do the research in a way that we're looking at loneliness as a disease and as something that should be treated before it's even started in someone and before it's impacted their health so much that we can no longer save them. So that's what I would like to say.
Yeah, I absolutely do agree with you. I'm saying that whilst it does lead to these things in, like a chronic sense, everyone who feels lonely doesn't need to worry about that. in terms of whether or not it should be treated as serious, I think that it should absolutely be treated like in a preventative sense to not lead to these things. But I don't think that, like personally, I don't need to hear that like loneliness has all of these outcomes to take it seriously. Like I think it's serious enough in itself. You've given your experiences of it, and that's enough for me to say we need to do something about this.
I think there's really important points raised there where it seems like it needs to be a balance with understanding the severity of the issue and the impacts it can have, and also considering maybe for each individual that it might not be helpful to like worry a lot about what the potential impacts are at the same time as you're experiencing loneliness. So I think it sounds like they can go hand in hand, and definitely this is like a serious thing that we really need to consider and be pushing support for. In that sense, I also wanted to ask about what we can do to support young people who are experiencing loneliness. So another listener sent in a question asking, are there interventions to help people manage alone time?
That's really interesting and such a great question. I think if we're able to give some management techniques, that could really help a lot of listeners. For me personally, when I was going through loneliness, I never saw any resources or anywhere to go or anywhere to talk to. And I found it even more isolating in that respect, because at the time when I was looking up resources, nothing would be available to me. And like I mentioned, mental health helplines didn't really help because they were for mental health and not necessarily loneliness specific. But one thing I've done in my activism journey is try to tackle this myself, because I didn't want other young people to feel alone in their journey. And whilst I'm not necessarily saying that I can solve or by any means make their loneliness feel better, I decided to design some postcards as a reflective journal. For example, a prompt on the front would be, what does loneliness feel like in my body? And then they would flip over the postcard and write a short journal to themselves and really think about the emotions and feelings that they are feeling at the current time when they are experiencing loneliness. And in that way, you can then look at it and reflect on it and understand the signs and symptoms of when you're feeling more lonely at certain times. Perhaps, for example, when I felt most lonely, I was in a room by myself. I never really pushed myself beyond my boundaries to go and meet new people. But by reflecting through these postcards, I was able to see more of a pattern in my behaviors. And then I thought, okay, well, tomorrow I'm going to meet one person, or tomorrow I'm going to text one person that I know that I can trust. And by that, and doing that management technique and having that reflective journal, I was able to see those patterns, and it really helped me manage loneliness.
I think that what people do to overcome loneliness is going to be really personal to, what's best for them. It's interesting that in the BBC loneliness experiment, where they asked people what to do about loneliness, and some people said, like join a club, and then that was also on people's list of like bad advice that they'd been given. So I think it's like very personal. If there's somewhere that you can meet like-minded people, I think that that's really interesting, and like not just like-minded in the sense that it's kind of surface level, but they've got like the same values and the same interests as you. Really beneficial. And yeah, I like Molly's ideas as well, about kind of reflecting on the patterns that you go through and thinking about ways to reach out to people. A lot of people say that, they find it very difficult to reach out to people, even though that they know that they kind of should. Sometimes it can just feel easier not to. So I think finding ways to do that is really, really important.
Yeah, I really like that idea, and I think you're right about it's kind of almost just smacking a plaster or band-aid onto the wound, right? With just saying, well, you should just join a club, or just saying, well, just go and do this, go and do that. It has to very much be down to the agency of the person that's going through loneliness, and they know their needs and what needs to be met. So I think you're right in the fact that when we come up with maybe management techniques, for loneliness, or perhaps preventative techniques in the future, it needs to be tailored. And this is why lived experience and qualitative methods like you have conducted yourself are really important.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like it's also just so useful to hear some of the different things you've tried. Like, for example, the postcards sounds like a really nice idea, and some of the other campaign work and things you've been doing, and how activism in loneliness is almost like a form of support sometimes. And I think Lily's point's really important as well, of like considering what's going to work for each individual, because some suggestions are not going to work for some, but they might work for others. There's a lot of conversation around loneliness in the media, and obviously we've mentioned like the World Health Organization talking about loneliness as well. So how has this conversation kind of made it into policy, or has it made it into policy?
There is a Minister for Loneliness in the UK, so it's definitely made its way into policy. And like Molly mentioned before about the social prescribing that is kind of going on at the moment, trying to link people up with, the things that meet their needs. Whether or not it's successful, I'm not sure. I'm not sure on what the research says about that just yet.
I can attest that it has been made into policy I'd say very recently, in the past year or so. You're right, Lily. Minister for Loneliness is Stuart Andrew. I am very grateful to know him and have worked on him in policy in Parliament to ensure that we have a national youth loneliness and loneliness strategy for the future. I'm very pleased that it's something that he's taken very seriously. And actually, one of my first experiences of policy making and policy influencing was when I was invited to the all-party parliamentary group on tackling loneliness back in May. And I was able to share my lived experience in front of Stuart and the Jo Cox Foundation, which also do amazing work on loneliness and loneliness policy. And I spoke a lot about my experience in university and how it was one of the most lonely periods of my life. And I'm really proud to say that 6 months later, there's been progression on this. Stuart has ensured that there's been a roundtable on tackling loneliness in university students very recently, and I was able to attend. So almost I'm holding him accountable for that. And recently, a fund by the Department for Culture, Media and Sports in government has set out a new fund for tackling loneliness. It's called Know Your Neighbourhood, and it's for tackling loneliness in the most deprived areas of the UK through volunteering and social action projects, which is really exciting. And I am just very pleased that it's going in the right direction. And I can imagine that, Stuart Andrew has definitely left a legacy with the loneliness work, and hopefully whoever is the next Minister for Loneliness continues that work.
I think that's really cool, Molly. You're really you're fighting the good fight in loneliness, and you also make it sound really accessible, which I think is so important. Like, it sounds like you don't have to be a politician or a minister to make a change in how we're supporting young people with loneliness or how we're talking about loneliness. Yeah, you can be a young person who has this experience, and you can, get out there and have your say, which is really cool. And we'll definitely link to basically all the campaigns and the different things that you've talked about in this episode on the website, so that if anyone listening wants to get involved, they can as well, and they know where to find you.
Thank you so much. I mean, by any means, I don't want to sugarcoat it. It's been a long and very hard journey. Of course, to experience loneliness in the first place was quite traumatic, so it shouldn't be happening at all. But again, it's through youth work and through the opportunities that have been given to me, or I've basically fought for, that I've managed to get into this position now. And my only wish is that in the next 10 years, young people have more decision-making power and are always around the table. If not, there shouldn't even be a table anyway. It should just be out in the communities, reaching out to those young people that need it most. And that's my vision. So thank you so much for that comment.
So now we come to the science or fiction question. We're experiencing a loneliness epidemic. Is it science or fiction?
So I think that this depends on what we consider as an epidemic. I think that loneliness is a really important issue for people at this time, and we all have probably had more experience of loneliness due to living through the pandemic and various technological changes and things like that. But loneliness has kind of always been there, but whether or not it's kind of a huge epidemic that we should be really scared about, I'm not really sure. I think that it's an important thing, definitely. How it's being framed could be potentially detrimental.
I, on the other hand, would say yes, it is science, it is an epidemic, but perhaps it's a silent epidemic. I mean, Lily, you're right in saying that it has been always been around, but I think that's the problem. It shouldn't be here in the first place. Like I said, as humans, we thrive off social connection. It's something that is our basic need, like a hierarchy of needs. And if that isn't met, then we can't meet other needs in our life and flourish and fulfill and feel fulfilled and feel empowered and have that sense of agency. Just in young people alone, 500,000 young people are now even more lonely, feeling even more lonely, feeling even more chronically lonely than before the pandemic. So that makes it 2 million now. Before the pandemic, it was 1.5 million. Even still, 1.5 million is huge. And so I think if we don't address it as an epidemic, it's only going to get worse, to the point that everyone will start feeling lonely. And perhaps that's when we'll see the physiological diseases come out more, and something that we know is preventative, which is really difficult for me as well, because I wish that, you know, there was a measure in place before I felt lonely so that I didn't have to feel lonely. And I think that if we treat it that way, then it will mean that we can find preventative measures in the future.
Typically, like, loneliness is seen as something that can signal to you that there's a social change that needs to be made within your social world. And I think that, like, when I've talked to young people about loneliness and asked them, does everyone feel lonely? It's always unanimously, yes, at some point everyone feels lonely within their lifetime. So I think that from my perspective, like, the stigma of loneliness can be dismantled by normalizing that loneliness in the transient sense of, you know, where you might feel lonely at a specific period of time, and be able to overcome that by putting certain techniques into action, can also lead to positive outcomes that some people have talked about, like finding new friends, finding new interests that they wouldn't have previously found. Whereas when loneliness becomes an issue is when it becomes chronic. So that's when it's a long-term issue. And that's when you see the detrimental health outcomes. That's when you see the issues for people's wider mental health and physical health. So I think that there's a difference and probably a distinction that I'd like to just make, that there's two kinds of ways to think about loneliness, in the sense that it can be transient and it can be overcome, and it can be chronic, and that's where we want to prevent it from becoming chronic.
These are really important points to raise, both the fact that it can be very severe and have implications, and also that it can be something that we can experience and overcome. Like, it's important to give light to both of those. So finally, before we finish, do you have any recommendations for our listeners if they want to find out more about this topic?
Listening to podcasts like this is a really great way of just being able to resonate with other people's experiences, as well as thinking about fact or fiction. It's really important, again, to back up it with evidence. But as well, I thought a more practical idea would be to have a look at Camerados, which is an organisation that have invented public living rooms across the UK and the world. And the idea is there's spaces across the UK often in public areas such as universities, in streets, in parks, and it's somewhere that you can meet with people in a safe environment and simply just sit down and have a cup of tea and connect through, human connection. And I think I've attended a few myself, and I know the CEO, Matt, he's amazing, and it's all about tackling social isolation. And it's clear that it's working because more and more places are popping up and public living rooms are popping up. And yeah, so I think if you can, find one near you, and hopefully that will help.
That's really nice. Thank you.
I would recommend listening to The Anatomy of Loneliness on Radio 4, which is a series of episodes talking about the results of the world's largest loneliness study, which was the BBC loneliness experiment. So that's really interesting. It kind of gives you some insights into who feels the loneliest and why, and what we can do about it.
Thank you so much to Molly and Lily for coming onto the podcast today, and thank you all for listening. You can follow us for updates and more information on Instagram and TikTok at Science or Fiction Pod, and on X or Twitter at Sci or Fiction Pod. If you want to get in touch or have suggestions for a future topic, you can email us at info@scienceorfiction.co.uk or DM us on social media. And as always, you can find the researchers' recommendations and links to support at scienceorfiction.co.uk. Thank you to the listeners who sent in their questions today, and to the Young Person Advisory Groups for their input on this series. Thank you to Kit Studio for the branding, and to Jamie Johnson for the music. See you next time.